Labour shortages amid the prolonged pandemic are looking to affect long-term recovery efforts worldwide, and Korea is not an exception. For more on the causes, the consequences and potential countermeasures of this phenomenon, I have Professor Yang Jung-seok from Catholic University. Professor Yang, it's a pleasure to have you back.
Happy to be here.
I also have Professor Kim Se-won from Ewha Women's University. It's good to see you again, Professor Kim.
Thank you for having me.
Right, Professor Yang, let's begin with the shortage of truck drivers over in the UK and the US that have led to much chaos.
Okay, well, for the United States, it's not just truck drivers, but the unskilled workers are getting unfilled for some industries, and firms have offered even bonuses to fill these unskilled jobs, but they're not getting a lot of offers by these workers. Now, the U.S. September year-on-year, wages rose by 4.2%. That's highest in at least 20 years. That's partially because of the labor shortage. And at first, it was thought that the labor shortage was due to spread of coronavirus, people frightened to go to work, and the strengthened unemployment insurance, which gave a lot of income. But those have disappeared. United States, they're not fully vaccinated, but still they're well on their way. But that still hasn't affected the labor shortage that much. The strengthened unemployment insurance has went away. And so in some states it went earlier than the others, but almost all states have shown labor shortages. So what is the problem? Well, there has been some interesting speculation. One is that there's lack of child care, so that the workers who are parents, they cannot go to their jobs, so they're not applying for jobs. A lot of people are sick and tired of current jobs. This applies to truck drivers as well. Truck drivers, supermarket workers, what we usually think of as relatively low-paying jobs. Those were classified as essential workers during the coronavirus, the worst of the coronavirus. A lot of people went to work at minimum wage or near minimum wage in these jobs, and a lot of them, frankly, died. And there has been some reflection on some of these workers, as well as in the press. Why should we risk our lives for minimum wage jobs? And it seems like a lot of people right now are turned off by those type of jobs, and they're seeking other opportunities while they can. And then because of the strengthened unemployment measures, a lot of these unskilled workers do have relatively high level of savings. So they might be sticking around and seeing what else that they can do. And then part of the problem is also immigration. A lot of these jobs, low-skilled jobs, are filled by people from Mexico or Latin America, but their movement has been restricted. Not only because of the coronavirus, but even before, because of the restrictions imposed by the Trump administration. So those jobs are impacting on low-skilled jobs, including truck drivers. Britain, the problem is similar, but it's worsened by Brexit, because a lot of those drivers were European in origin. And also, a lot of the actual driving jobs were done by European drivers who are passing through Britain on their way from Europe to Britain, and then from Britain back to Europe. But they also took up some routes from Britain to Britain, and now those have all disappeared because of Brexit.
Right, I see. And aside from the transportation industry then, Professor Kim, which other sector appears to be suffering quite a bit, or suffering perhaps the most in terms of labor shortage?
Well, as Professor Yang pointed out, in the U.S., there is a serious labor shortages in labor-intensive industries like restaurant, hotels, and agriculture, and so on. Also in UK, the gas crisis has been generated from the shortages of truck drivers who delivers all oil products to local gas stations. In Korea, we have relatively less serious situation on labor shortages, but it is said that agricultural industries and constructions are experiencing the shortages of the labor.
Right, I see. And Professor Yang, as you mentioned earlier, some pundits are indeed linking this phenomenon, labor shortage, to the pandemic, claiming that some workers are now using this opportunity to perhaps reassess their life priorities. What are your thoughts? Okay, well,
it's right now, it's the United States is not fully out of coronavirus yet, so that is also impacting, I think, some areas. As I mentioned, lack of childcare is often mentioned as being a problem, but I think for some people, as I mentioned in the last question, they were shocked because of the coronavirus. They are seeking new opportunities, but we also have to remember that the United States is still undergoing a lot of the coronavirus problem. Their vaccination has stalled, and also it's a relatively a new situation. A lot of people do have a lot of savings saved up. But once that savings goes away, they may reapproach their aspect. Right now, I think a lot of people, because they were so tired out by doing their jobs during the coronavirus and these so-called essential jobs, that they are looking for new opportunities. But before the coronavirus, these were unskilled jobs with perhaps too many workers who are trying to vie for these jobs. So it may go back to that situation eventually. But right now, we're sort of in the middle part, a transition part, where a lot of people who may want to come back to work cannot because of childcare or because of vaccination problems. And a lot of people who had done these jobs are just now just so sick and tired of it that they don't want to go back. So we may be seeing a temporary phenomena. There's no reason to believe right now that all of these people who used to be truck drivers or restaurant workers will go out of those businesses. But for now, the United States does have shortage of workers because of these workers. A lot of these workers don't want to go back. And also, I should mention, there has been a large increase in demand for these items because the reduction of distancing has started the U.S. pent-up spending, so so-called revenge spending. So U.S. is undergoing a relatively large increase in demand, which is also contributing to this problem.
I see. Meanwhile, Professor Kim, here in Korea, our exit strategy from the pandemic has also led to our own challenges within the hospitality sector. As you mentioned earlier, workers are not returning to restaurants and cafes, so owners there are having quite a bit of problems. What more can you tell us about the causes and perhaps traits of Korea's own labor shortage?
Well, it looks that the labor shortage in Korea shares almost the same factors of labor shortage in UK and US. After the outbreak of pandemic last year, the supply of foreign workers is seriously decreased because the border is almost shut down over 1.5 years. And more importantly, the incentive to work to general workers is really weakened. For example, the gap between minimum wage and insurance, unemployment insurance payment, including government cash supports, is really, really tiny these days. So people, particularly young workers, temporary workers working in restaurants, hotels, and so on, their incentive to go back to work is really weakened. And for some educated and experienced workers who are working in the hardest hit industry, like airline companies, left the industry forever because they wanted to start their own business over a pandemic.
I see. Professor Yang, do tell us a bit more now about the potential repercussions of the shortage in manpower for the consumer and then perhaps for the economy as a whole.
Okay, well, for the consumer, it does mean a further increase in inflation. For example, we're experiencing a lot of increases in prices of raw materials. Coffee houses have raised the price of coffee and so on, but those, surprisingly, the cost of foodstuff for the restaurants, cost of coffee for coffee shops actually form a minority of the total cost. The major component is actually labor cost and the real estate cost, and both of them have gone up a lot during the coronavirus. So we may see a further increase in inflation as well. And then for the economy as a whole, until we work this problem out, we will probably continue to see the further reduction and shortage in jobs. But I should also mention that this is hitting very differently between different industries. We're facing a lot of shortages in, say, agriculture, very low-paying industries, or low-value-added industries, especially where you meet a lot of people, restaurants, tourism, and so on, partially because of the coronavirus, partially because of various restrictions. A lot of the jobs are really not impacted that much at all. For example, education. If you talk about education for elementary schools, junior high schools have been impacted a lot because you have to meet with those students face to face. But if you're doing your job through telecommunications, that hasn't been affected very much. So the impact will be very different industry to industry.
Right, of course. Now, Professor Kim, Professor Yang has mentioned that this particular phenomenon of labor shortage would be temporary. What are your thoughts on how long this labor shortage will last?
Well, it became very tough to answer that question, Sunny. When labor shortage started early this year, almost everyone expected that the shortage does not last long because workers were supposed to go back to paid job as soon as economic recovers. Actually, U.S. Federal Reserve early this year argued that this labor shortage and high inflation is temporary. But these days, U.S. Federal Reserve acknowledges that thanks to a disrupted global production chain and a very strong demand for all goods and services, the higher inflation and labor shortage could be more persistent than expected earlier. So I would say the labor shortage will be extended to the summer of next year.
I see. Professor Yang, you mentioned that the impact of the labor shortage would impact industries in very different ways. Having said that then, what are the prospects for the IT industry as well as that of battery?
Okay, well, IT industry, they have been hit a lot by increases in demand because people are telecommunicating from home. But Korea has a long-term problem with getting enough people for the IT industry and the battery industry, especially battery industry, because, well, these are relatively high-skilled jobs. You need a lot of technical training, and the Korean universities right now cannot keep up with that demand for these technical workers. Partially, it's because the Korean university system is not geared to raise the number of these technical workers very quickly. Korean universities have strict limits on number of people that they can have in certain majors. They have strict limits on the total number of students that they can take. So it is almost impossible to increase the number of people in certain majors very quickly. Not only is there legal problems because the education department sets up these rules, education ministry sets up these rules, but also there's internal fight with the professors because if there's too few students in your department will be getting less budget, less attention, and they may even cancel your department. So these are very sensitive issues inside the university, and it's turning out to be a very sensitive political problem as well. So it is fundamentally a long-term problem at the supply side. On the demand side, a lot of students do recognize that there is more demand for technical workers. They do want to get into that area, but they're also a bit nervous about that because, well, in the past, when there was a recession, or when there were some problems with companies, the first people that were let go were technical people. So some students are nervous about going into these technical areas. They have to start preparing from high school, and they think that going into a more business-oriented major is a safer bet in the long run. So these are type of problems that we have to address.
Has that also been the case with regard to the pandemic? Have we seen a shortage of technical workers? Were they first let go?
In the pandemic, less so, because the demand for the IT services had gone up during the pandemic, because we're telecommunicating more, we're using more IT services, and during the pandemic, exports of Korea IT-related products went up for the same reasons. The other countries are using more IT products, so there has been more exports of semiconductors, computers, and so on. So at least for this time around, there has been an increase in demand for IT-oriented technical people.
Right, fortunately. Professor Kim, do you suppose then an immediate hike in wages and the expansion of perhaps work incentives will serve to perhaps solve the labor shortage in the near future?
If employers double the salaries, for example, they can successfully hire more people, but companies, particularly medium and small-sized companies, do not have enough resources to do that. And as we talked about, also the workers became less sensitive in working incentives, and over the pandemic there were serious changes in industrial structure. So workers more want something more robust and consistent jobs over changing economy and over maybe over another pandemic. So, for example, temporary workers in restaurants who serves the clients moved to motorbike delivery service because it is more flexible and more profitable. So, like this, there will be lots of movements between traditional jobs to new jobs, IT-related.
I see. I understand, Professor Kim, that this might be a very difficult question, but essentially, then, in your opinion, what are some fundamental ways to deal with the problem of labor shortage?
Well, I think there's two separate solutions. In the short run, we have to have more flexibility in importing labor from foreign countries. So I think that's the only way to supply more workers, particularly more labor-intensive industries like restaurants, hotels, and wedding halls, and so on. And in the long run, we have to improve the working quality for Korean workers through more experience and more education. So by doing that, we need less people in every production places. So that means our production procedure will be more integrated and more technical way. So that's the only way that we can handle the labor shortages.
Right.
I think it's worth pointing out that the trying to use less workers, it's been a long-term trend. Because of the rapid rise in wages, especially minimum wages, there has been more automation in restaurants, in convenience stores. So in the long term, we will see less demand for unskilled workers. What's happening right now is that a lot of unskilled workers were additionally let go because of the coronavirus. This is a short-term problem. But now, because the demand is coming back, we want those unskilled workers to come back and work in restaurants and fields and so on, but they're not coming back partially because of they still have problems with coronavirus. They still have some problems with childcare. They can go make better money elsewhere, for example, in delivery. But in the long term, the demand for unskilled workers are, I think, still going to continue to fall.
Right. Professor Yang, this is something that Professor Kim touched upon. There are critics who are calling for greater efforts to perhaps ease the red tape over the employment of foreign workers for the farming industry, for fisheries, as well as small and mid-sized factories, or even restaurants and cafes, as Professor Kim has mentioned. What are your thoughts on this?
I think that is absolutely necessary because, well, we've talked about the long-term demographic problems a lot. There will be less Korean people to fill these jobs. And if you look at other foreign countries which also have reduction in young people, demographic problems, they absolutely have to depend on foreign workers. And right now, Korea does have the lowest fertility rate at about 0.8% per women. They're trying to raise that, and some of it will come back, I think, after the coronavirus, but None of the advanced countries have a replacement rate of fertility 2.1. The best that they can do is around 1.8. I don't think Korea will be doing that well, maybe 1.2 or 1.5, which means that we will suffer from lack of workers. Most Koreans will not want to go into those unskilled jobs because, well, they're going to be investing in themselves. They're going to get education, trying to get better jobs. So a lot of these unskilled jobs are going to get unfulfilled unless we have foreign workers.
Right. Professor Kim, then, against that backdrop, some observers are saying that a full-day work week arrangement may serve as another alternative to the labor shortage. Do you agree?
I partially agree with that. It looks that it is a reasonable idea to dampen the shock from labor shortages in the long run. Because the young workers particularly are more interested in flexible working hours and the quality of the life. So if these 4 working days per week goes well, I think that can attract more workers to the working places. But this plan, I think, requires the structural changes in the working places. In other words, the workers should be improving their working quality. In economic terms, it is called productivity. So with only 4 working days, they need to produce same amount of goods and services in a single week. So for that purpose, they have to improve their working quality. Otherwise, the 4 working days per week plan is not something sustainable in the long run.
It might affect the economy negatively then.
Right.
All right, Professor Kim, as always, thank you very much for your thoughts. Professor Yang, thank you very much for your insights.